Everyone, the SGFT Library and the English and the Creative Writing Department invite you to join Abhivyakti, a book discussion forum on place, intimate encounters with cities by Professor Ananya Vajpeyi in conversation with Professor Saikat Majumdar. Professor Ananya Vajpeyi is a scholar and writer working at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory, and critical philology. She is the author of the award-winning book Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, and most recently of Place, Intimate Encounters with Cities. Signature of the Bin, her translation of Father, the late Kailash Vajpeyi's Hindi poetry, has just appeared from Sahitya Academy. She is a professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi, and has been a visiting professor at Ashoka University in 2023 and 2024, teaching the foundation course, Great Books. She writes widely for newspapers and magazines in India and overseas about ideas, arts, and politics. She is currently completing a book about the modern life of Sanskrit. Professor Saikat Majumdar is Professor of English and Creative Writing at Ashoka University, is the author of 5 novels, most recently The Remains of the Body, 2024, and 3 works of criticism and non-fiction, most recently The Amateur, 2024. We also have a couple of copies of Professor Vajpeyi's book here, there, that you can purchase at a great discount. You can also get the copy signed by the author, so don't miss it.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and good to see all of you. Lunch hour is always precious, so glad those of you could come. For me, reading this book was a very pleasurable experience, very personal experience, because and if you know me, that cities have always been a very important part of my own making, my thought, and particularly place. I think I, both as a reader and as a writer, I connect to works which have a sense of place, which evoke an atmosphere, which convey a sense of people. This is what, and I think Ananya's book does all of these things really beautifully. And it's also really diverse. So those of you who read it, and I encourage those of you who haven't to pick it up, it's really cuts across culture, it's truly global. I think what it ends up creating is a kind of a world republic of letters, because her understanding of cities is very much through culture narratives, texts, literature. And that's a question I want to ask her. What do cities really mean to her, the idea of place? But let me ask, Ananya, I'll start the discussion with a question about the title itself. And we were talking about this yesterday on email, and you pointed out that, I think I mentioned it by mistake, Places. But actually the title of the book is Place, not Places. And that is actually very interesting right away, because it says place, but then the subtitle is Intimate Encounter with Cities. So the plurality comes in the subtitle, but the title is singular. So I wanted to ask, start by talking a bit about the idea of singularity of place and the plurality of it. So in spite of this really global, staggering plurality of the cities, is there something singular about the idea of place that has struck you while experiencing this life and writing about it? Of course, the book is very much like a memoir. It's Ananya's own wandering through the cities and places, and her evocation of the idea of place. So if you could start by talking about that a bit.
Thanks, Saikat. Great pleasure to be here. Actually, there's a funny story with this title, which is that my publisher and editor came to me with this title already in her head. And she said to me, look, you've written so much over the years, I've been following your writing, and I think we should put some of your essays together which are about cities. And actually it hadn't occurred to me that, that I had been doing this over a long period of time in a diverse set of publication venues and forums, magazines, newspapers, journals, all kinds of things, different lengths of piece, different styles of piece. I didn't think that there was anything to congeal them into, something that would have a strong signature. And she said, no, you leave that to me. It's going to be called Place. And I see a strong voice which unites even the earliest pieces with more recent ones. So actually it took some convincing from her to make me even see and understand that it's not the necessarily the diversity of places, but rather the sort of singular problem of feeling oneself out of place or between places, or in a sense trying to find a place where one can be. And that is what I think she was after. So, I mean, it's not like I had any choice as to the title, because, and the subtitle actually, she came up with both. And then, as we worked together, we read through a lot of my older writings, some unpublished materials, some fiction, some non-fiction, etc. Eventually, I ended up writing half the book for this anthology. So I only just really wrote it sort of last year. Because by then I had myself understood what place is doing as a theme, to bind all of this, globe-trotting and this wandering in past and present and in the alleyways of literature and criticism, all of that, to bind it together. I myself was sort of able to fall in with that plan.
No, I mean, publishers make us do strange things. Publishers and marketing people often make us do things. But I'm glad that at least you were convinced. But I actually find that idea very intriguing, that when places become place, obviously in a way we are moving away from the concrete nature of places to an abstract idea of place. I think it's very attractive, but do you think in some ways the kind of sensory particularity of different places gets lost when you go with the concept of place?
The visual, the sensory, the architectural, the urban, the historical, the literary. I think all of that particularity is there, but
it's there in the book.
It's there in the book, but it's also, it's not there in the way you would expect if I was writing this for a travel magazine and trying to tell my readers, these are the 10 places you should visit, if you go to Venice.
The tourist guide,
So it doesn't have that order of particularity. But actually, I think that my encounters with these places are quite particular. And maybe even idiosyncratic or eccentric in some sense, because it's not clear that, somebody could replicate that way of traveling, or like follow my map, or take directions in any way from me, or take advice from me, on what to see, what to do, and so on, or what to read. It's a very personal journey in some sense, and in that sense, I'm happy with the abstraction of it, because then I can give it, the map that I want, the cartography that makes sense in terms of, my encounter with these different cities.
No, that's a great answer. I mean, to kind of keep it open as a concept so that I can fill in the places, because it's not anybody's Venice or anybody's Delhi. It's my Venice and my Delhi, and it's very much your. And that actually makes me wonder that is in the end the city is about place at all, or is a place really about a place? Because especially when it's something as dense and rich as a city, because a lot of the sketches of these places are about people. So people actually play a very big role. Of course, you talk about architecture, you talk about landscape, you talk about I think you talk about one of your friends was very much into architecture planning, so you notice that. But very quickly, what we get is really story of people. And there are many notable, very interesting people. The account of you're making a Kanban in where was that? In which city of Italy?
Venice.
In Venice, yeah. In Venice, meeting a Kanban in Venice, which obviously also interestingly brings up your father's experience of meeting Beckett, your father in Paris. Then the figure of your father himself, the Hindi poet Ananya Vajpeyi, he plays quite a big role in this book in different texts. Then I'm thinking of that figure in Pune, Pandurang Suktankar, that's almost written in a fictional way. And every piece about every place is really about people. So that's my question to you, what is a place really? Is it really places? I mean, it's a cliche to say that a place is made memorable by people. But what does that really mean? I mean, of course, we are sitting right in the middle of a university, in the middle of nowhere, and yet it seems very artificial, and yet the people give Ashoka the character that it does. So if you could say a little bit about the relationship of people and places, and eventually did you write a book that should have been better called People? or do you want to stick to the title Places?
Please.
Well, if you think about it, Ashoka was a person, right? And he was the Mauryan emperor. He was giver of the edicts. He was the sovereign who changed the meaning of sovereignty from violence towards non-violence. And it's the idea of Ashoka as a person that has actually materialized spatially here in Sonipat, which you say is the middle of nowhere. But what difference does it make where it is if it's the idea that you're after, right? The idea of a certain kind of vision, the idea of a certain kind of justice, the idea of all of the things that Ashoka stands for. Ashoka the Great, I mean, right? Who lived in the years BCE, 300 and something to 200 and something. Right? So in that sense, for me also, I think people sometimes act as my guides into strange places. They sometimes act as, I don't know, like, Virgil leads Dante through the circles of hell, right? You always need a poet to accompany you, right? You need, I always need, and I benefit from a literary figure, a literary interlocutor who could be living or dead. I've been lucky that in many cases, the people I've interacted with are still alive and I'm able to talk to them, not just read their work. But they act as my interpreters and as my guides, into the life of a city, into the history of a city, into the particular aesthetic of a city. And they also become sort of what is most memorable in many ways. When all else has changed or faded away, you do remember these conversations you had with someone, or something that someone told you that then you could go and figure out for yourself. And so whether it's my father, or it's Ashish Nandi, or it's Agamben, or it's Pamuk, or it's Sebald, or it's Edward Said, or all of these characters who are in and out, or Ambedkar for the Bombay chapter and so on. There are both, sometimes real interlocutors and sometimes sort of a shorthand for me to call up a set of ideas and to call up some particular aspect of the life of that city that only that person really has been the, the spokesperson for, or the narrator for. And with Pamuk in Istanbul, I feel that very strongly. And in Europe, I mean, often for me it has been W.G. Sebald. But again, as I said, I mean, these are idiosyncratic choices, in a sense, Ashoka is a big banner. It's a big tent. A lot of people can appreciate, the greatness of Ashoka and will probably flock to this place. Yeah, it's a capacious possibility. Some of my choices may be much narrower, more particular. But many of them are not, because after all, everybody reads these people, right? I mean, a lot of people read, many of the books and characters and writers I mentioned. So they act in that way as attractors, as magnets, as hooks, as pegs, or not just me.
And they are connected to places, but they're also very global. In many ways, their ideas have traveled across cultures. What I noticed, however, was almost all of these figures are men. In fact, the names you just mentioned also right now are all male figures. And I was thinking a bit about it, and like two things came to me. One is also the way you talk about your father and your mother. I mean, I think I'm allowed to get into this space because you've talked about these. You talk a lot about your father, the poet Ananya Vajpeyi. You don't say that much about your mother. There's much less about your mother. One thing, at one point you mentioned that, I think from my father I got the imagination and the talent, and I think you describe your mother as practical. I mean, I love that part where she's talking about, let's live in Varanasi and we'll do that. I mean, that's the most memorable glimpse of your mother I got from the whole book, whereas there's a lot more about your father. And then again, all these places are men, and I think in the end, this book is really not just about place, but as I said, the World Republic of Letters, which by the way was used by a female scholar, Pascal Casanova, the idea. But this World Republic of Letters seems to be very male. And you mentioned Spivak, and I think your father meeting a few French feminists earlier on, but very passingly. So what have you thought about this, or is it that, how did the World Republic of Letters become so masculine?
It's not just I who thought about it. My publisher, she's a feminist, pioneering feminist publisher, right? She set up Kali for Women together with Urvashi Butalia, and in fact, when she first approached me, I said, I'm sorry, I don't work on gender, I don't work on women's studies, I'm not, knowledgeable about feminism as,
You also mentioned writing about Gandhi, Tagore and Ambedkar, the three founding figures, but again, three male figures. So.
That's right. So I told her that, and she said, that's not your concern. I'm not, it's not that I only publish women writers, or I only publish feminist women writers, or anything like that. And I really want to do this. But then, over the course of doing the book together, and she's a very hands-on kind of an editor, I mean, she had a say in every line, really. She did mention many times that, look, where are the women in your book? And in fact, the first blurb she got for the book was from Geeta Hariharan, who's both her friend and my friend, and a very well-known writer, and somebody I know well by having written for her, but it was done as a statement that I must be more sort of inclusive in my references and in my sort of whatever my the world that I'm mapping and creating. As far as my mother is concerned, actually I wrote an essay for another anthology a couple of years ago called The Book of Dog, and it was written by all sorts of people who are writers or some kind of well-known people, celebrities of various kinds, and their relationship with their dog, right? And it's full of these very touching, very hilarious, very sad, very moving stories. And my story was about my mother and her dogs, right? And the fact that dogs come into my life through her, and you can get a big sense of who she was and what she was like and what our home was like. My father is a very peripheral figure in that memoir, that piece. That piece isn't included here because it's not primarily about cities, right? It's about dogs. But I don't, how should I put it? I mean, there's no premeditated agenda here because, in a sense, these essays were written over a long period of time, as I said, most of them, and for different publications, or sometimes just to sit in my drawer for 20 years or whatever. Almost in no case was I thinking about representation as such, in the sense of, is this identity suitably represented in this book? It's not, it was not ideologically driven writing. Even in my academic work, it has not been, which is why if I have like 5 founding fathers in my book, Righteous Republic, they're all men. It's true, they're all men. But you could also say, none of them is a Muslim, right? Or, all sorts of objections people have raised over time. But my answer always is that this is not an exercise in social science, in ideology, ideological deployment of identities, representation in any kind of, United Colors of Benetton kind of a way. It's life. It's life. And, there are women in the lives of all the men that I talk about. And sometimes I know their stories. In the Ambedkar case, I've told that story actually.
Yeah.
And I've told that story in another academic essay as well, about, his sort of thwarted and incomplete love life, you could say personal life, which has been systematically kept out of the archive and out of the literature. And what that means for his relationship with both London, where his friend lived, and with Bombay, where he could never bring her, right? And so it's not that I'm oblivious, to the multiplicity of genders and identities, but I'm not. This book is not some sort of an exercise in gender justice or anything like that.
Yeah.
As I told Ritu, like on day 1, and she said, "That's not your headache. I want you to write this book." So, okay.
Therefore, the question maybe is not so much about your choice, but what this archive is. As you said, when we create an archive without thinking, and yet the archive comes out without representation of any one major social group, then maybe it says something about the archive itself. It's not something you need to do. And I think in this case, as I read the book, it's really about the World Republic of Letters. Is the World Republic of Letters primarily masculine? That's the question that I ask. And then maybe the follow-up question will be, what is that we could do to change it? Or maybe that's not the job of this book. It lies outside. But the story you said about your mother is also very interesting. I think what you ended up, I haven't read that piece, but it sounds like it's a sketch about domestic life. So again, I kind of think like, so the public spaces are the ones which belong to men, and if we bring the private spaces in, then the women are there. And I have myself engaged with this in many ways in my thinking, in my writing. I think that's why private spaces are very important to me. And yet consigning the genders to the public and the private also seems to be limiting in the end. So that's also, I mean, this is so public, this is so city, and then and I think it's a fact that cities are not always hospitable places for women. The flaneur, Virginia Woolf to create a female flaneur. It was simply not safe for flaneurs to, female flaneurs, I mean, as Yeats had a poem about this, the only woman who walked around the streetwalk is basically the prostitute. So clearly, if you're a man walking around the streets, you are a man of leisure, but a woman walking around. So these are historical realities, I completely agree. And yet it sort of makes me think like, what does it say about the archive itself? And again, I can't help thinking that if you're a man writing this book, this exclusion of women would look different, maybe to a feminist publisher. But I think, in a sense, what do you think of that?
Well, actually, my mother was a professor of English, like yourself, and also quite a prominent activist in the second part of her life in field of sustainability and consumer rights and women's health and so on. And she was in a sense as much an intellectual as my father, and very well known in her own right. So I don't think she ever was confined to the private space or anything like that. And actually, if you were to read that essay about dogs, it's called "Until Death Do Us Part," and the first scene actually opens with how we got these two little Lhasa Apsos when I was a small child, which is that my mother is driving me home from my grandparents' house, and these two dogs are being walked on the street, and she stops the car and gets out to play with them, and the gentleman who's walking them says, "Do you want to take them?" And we bring them home. And then there's another scene in which she's coming home from college after finishing her classes. She comes home at lunchtime, and basically the dogs stumble out of the gate to meet her, and it's such an moment of excitement because I'm home from school. My father has not yet left to teach us classes because they used to have to share the car. And it's very much a working woman's home in a sense. So I don't know that I can answer this question, because in some sense it's not a very fair question. Again, it's assuming that there's some sort of ideological point here, but there isn't. I mean, it's an accident.
It's not a point, it's the reality of the situation that you've represented. And that's what I'm questioning, the situation itself, not your representation of it at all. You've been extremely fair in showing what is the reality. I think you've been very fair in showing that.
Actually, just this morning or last night, one of my closest friends in Istanbul is an economic historian, and she is a professor at Boğaziçi University, and she's also very well-known Turkish intellectual and very interesting woman politically. And she's been arrested during coups, she's had to flee the country, she's come back, she's been in America, she's been in Europe, and now she's old and she lives back at home. And I was asking her, I said, have you watched the Museum of Innocence, the Netflix show which is based on Pamuk's novel? And she said, my dear, the next time you're here, we have to take you away from this. She doesn't like him, by the way. She's friends with his brother, who's also an economist. And she said, next time you come here, we have to show you a different Istanbul. This is the alienated vision of the intelligentsia and the bourgeoisie, all this kind of stuff. She uses all this like left-wing vocabulary. And she said, come and I will, the bookmakers of Istanbul have invited me to give a talk. And the title of the talk is Capitalism Fate? Right? And I will take you to meet these. They're artisans. They're makers of leather-bound books. So I'm going to show you a very different Istanbul than this Nişantaşı, whatever, this high society, white Turk stuff. And, I trust her. And I've spent long periods staying in a house and also playing with her dog, by the way, who's called Prince. And so it's not, again, I mean, I'm sort of throwing up my hands here because I don't, it's not, I just do not come from that sort of a gendered sensibility that, I mean, I read women writers, I have women friends, obviously all of those things, right? And I have found myself answering the question of, for example, how do you walk around a city? Are there certain parts of the city you can't go to? Are there certain times of day when you feel unsafe as a woman? I have been asked that question, and it's true, I do. There are things that I won't do on my own, right? There are places I won't go. And I am constrained by, the body that I have, which is female. So my curiosity may push me sometimes to enter into spaces which are quote-unquote dangerous or risky. But usually I will try to find other ways to travel, and not, I mean, I'd rather live to tell the tale, as I've often said, than do crazy stuff in order to, produce an amazing work.
I'm absolutely,
Completely, that's really well put. I think the reality is much more complex and much more full, and I think it will come out in many ways. I think I want to turn to a passage which I thought was very interesting. I think this is actually on page, beginning of chapter 12, so 162. I think the sense of freedom we're talking about, I think this, the opening paragraph of the essay, The Society of the Spectacle, has a clear sense of that, this sense of, and this really caught my attention because, and I would request you to read maybe from this a little bit. I think what you say here is very interesting, is that I had this sense of freedom. I finished my PhD, I was 32, I suddenly felt I'm free and I could go anywhere. Genuine spiritual autonomy, I think that's the expression you use. I mean, it really struck me. I mean, I also finished my PhD around the same age, but I was very much in the American academic machinery to be professionalized, and I kept going and I kept going, and I think it took me some unlearning to again kind of get my peg back to becoming a writer. I think that way being in India is wonderful in that it's not so hyper professionalized like the capitalist machinery of America. And I think what I wanted to ask you, about this passage, maybe you can read it, and then tell us a bit about the identity that you developed based on this paragraph. Because in some ways you said you traveled around, you moved to different places, and then I know you've been with CSDS for a long time, but at the same time you haven't had a very traditional intellectual identity. So much of your work is on language and literature, but you're deeply immersed in political theory, and I think we were also talking about that, it's kind of hard to peg me in a particular department. So would you say this freedom kind of continued, and it has been kind of ambivalent? So maybe you can start by reading something from here and then talk about it a bit.
Must be careful before having conversations with you, I think. You don't know when they'll turn up. Where do you want me to read? Just the beginning?
I like the beginning very much, but you
can read, so this is a chapter about Amsterdam, actually, and it's called The Society of the Spectacle, which is actually the title of a book by Guy Debord, who I was reading a lot at that time. So I had a kind of a postdoctoral residency in Amsterdam, and this essay takes off from there. And in an earlier chapter, I described how I was in New York City in September 2001. So there's a whole thing about 9/11. And then this is a few chapters later. 3 years after September 2001, in September 2004, I found myself in Amsterdam as a scholar in residence at this organization called the WAG Society for Old and New Media. My life here was unrecognizable relative to the way things were for me in New York around the time of 9/11. I had got my PhD from the University of Chicago. My then partner and I had split up, and I was beginning to experience, for the first time since my formal education began at age 5 and concluded at age 32, a taste of genuine personal autonomy.
That's a great phrase right there. Genuine personal autonomy. That really struck me.
I mean, unlike kids these days, I mean, I never had a gap year or a year when I was trying to figure out what. I just kept going, and my parents would always make fun of me that, we sent you off to school in class 1. And, 30 years later, we still haven't got you back. So I traveled by myself that whole summer, visiting friends in America, England, and Europe. I returned to my parental home in Delhi after a decade away. I wrote what I liked, I saw whom I liked, I went where I liked. I was immunized against hurt because my heart had already been broken so comprehensively that I couldn't feel genuine attachment to anyone or any place. I became accustomed to moving on, living out of a suitcase, connecting with others mainly through my laptop, a newly acquired Apple PowerBook bought in Palo Alto, which I loved more than I did any human being, and looking with new eyes at the wide world around me. I had spent 15 years at university without a break or a gap year. I couldn't wait to get my head out of manuscripts and exams at long last. One of the first things I did was revisit the places where I feared being on my own, without my former partner. So I went back to Bangalore, to Goa, to Delhi, to Oxford, to Chicago, to New York, to London, to Paris, and finally, here I was in Amsterdam, to Seoul. I learned how to travel to forget rather than to remember, a most useful skill for the heartbroken. I thoroughly enjoyed rediscovering each place without necessarily seeing it through my former companion's eyes, mapping my own routes, taking photographs from my vantage, looking at buildings and bridges and parks and marketplaces as though I had never seen them before, teaching myself about form, light, and perspective simply because I was the one who was there in the moment at any given place. It was liberating, knowing that no one had to approve, corroborate, or challenge what I made of my scene, of any scene in which I happened to be present. I made a virtue of leaving behind cities, people, moods, memories. When I look back later on that brief season of freedom, it struck me that I was fortunate to experience, even if temporarily, how the world must feel to a man.
I have the answer right there about gendered sensibility. So clearly, very much there. I mean, do you want to say a bit more about how whether you've continued that life in the sense of intellectually belonging to any discipline or institution, or you feel like, I mean, I think many of us who write and think feel sometimes institutions are both rich and limiting.
Well, this is sort of the angst of my entire existence, I would say, is, do I want to be in academia or not? And it started very early, even when I was in my 20s and a graduate student, because while I was trying to do my field research and write my dissertation, I started writing fiction, and I was already writing reviews and writing little essays, and then I started.
No conflict between academia and writing fiction, I'm sure.
People like you I've met so late in my life. At the time, it seemed like a big choice to be made. And in fact, my first job out of my PhD was with a newspaper. and I was offered that job out of nowhere. I mean, I literally got a phone call one day, and the editor of this paper, who is also himself a novelist, said to me, would you like to come and work for us? And I said, look, I have zero journalistic experience. And he said, doesn't matter. We'll teach you what you need to learn. And so I went along, but I hated it so much that I left in, I don't know, less than 6 months. Although it was a fantastic salary relative to what I would get as a postdoc at JNU. I mean, it was 3 or 4 times, even then, the amount of money. But anyway, I have struggled with this, honestly, Saikat, and not everyone. I think many people at this university have managed to walk that tightrope much more successfully in terms of being qualified academics and teachers, while also being successful writers in various genres. I think so many of your colleagues, probably the entire English department and the creative writing department and the translation studies, it's all full of these kind of people who have done that. And Ashoka has provided a good home for them. I found that sort of a home at CSDS, of course, many years before Ashoka existed even. And it has always traditionally been that kind of institution. In fact, I was first offered a position there before I finished my PhD by the then chairman of their board, who was U.R. Ananthamurthy. And he said, I want you to not be in America, I want you to come back to India and come to the center. And at that time, I was terrified by the idea that I would have to go back and live with my parents. So I went to Amsterdam, in fact. And it took me another 10 years before I could come back to CSDS. And I came just for a year as a visiting fellow. I had a job in the States, a teaching job in the States. And Ashish Das said to me, he said, well, see how you like it. And I was like, Ashish, I'm only here till next August or whatever. And he said, I suspect you will find that location matters. That's it. That's all he said. And, that was in 2011. And I'm still at CSDS.
Go back to
I never
place.
left.
Yeah.
I never left. Because what started happening was that being there and not constrained, we don't have departments by discipline. We're just a bunch of social scientists and a few humanities people. Very small group. And we have had traditionally the autonomy to do the research we like, the writing we like, and do the traveling we like. And I got drawn into this world of Indian institutions, social movements, parts of the country where my colleagues were doing election studies, where, far-flung places from my kind of very Delhi perspective. I mean, back then is when I first met Shimona, who was sitting in Siliguri at that time and teaching at a university there. And, for me, it was very exciting to go to Baroda, to go to Siliguri, to go to Guwahati, to go to, just all parts of the country and figure out what are people doing in these old and new institutions. What are their struggles? What is their environment? What is their intellectual milieu? And it was so varied depending on the literary traditions, the linguistic knowledge, that characterizes every part of this enormous country, right? And I just thought, I'm never going to be able to find anything half as interesting if I carry on living abroad. It's fine to travel, but the kind of, I felt that, one's mandate in an institution like CSDS is to is to participate in public life and to have some form of public pedagogy that one undertakes as a responsibility, because one has been lucky enough to be educated, because one can have a broad perspective, because one is not constrained by disciplinary sort of shackles, at least internally within the institution for purposes of promotion and things like that. So it just allows you to really, go out there and learn, and also teach and communicate in a way that I think is very difficult when people are so put upon by the demands of their professional life, which are also about educating students, but not in a broader sense, not necessarily, just enough for them to pass their exams, but not necessarily, beyond that. And so now when I come back to teach and I come to a place like this, it seems to me, again, it's a good match for my type of person. This is why I teach great books, because people always say, what department are you teaching great books through? And I say, I don't need to teach it through any department. I can make my own list of books, and my only responsibility is to convince my students that these are indeed great books.
Right.
However I constitute that list.
Yeah.
No, I think the interactive part is one of the most interesting parts of this book. It's really very interactive, and that's actually the last question I want to ask, because I know I'm sure some of you in the audience have questions too. Is one thing you say in this book repeatedly is that ideas are not enough, books are not enough. I think it's wonderful to be able to meet people and to discuss ideas with them often, and that's why so many of the people you've sought out are writers, whatever kind, imaginative, critical. I don't really think much about the difference between the different kinds. It's not a really big deal for me. But and I don't think you draw that distinction either. Philosophers, linguistics, novelists, they're all there. But and I really like this idea of interacting in person. And then you say something like, oh, in this modern world of Coursera and web courses, we're moving away from it. And that really gave me pause, because of course we are in a post-pandemic world and a lot of things have changed. And this idea of interacting in person is wonderful, but it also requires a certain kind of privilege, a certain kind of mobility. And at the same time, it's a kind of a responsibility. What you just said about traveling to different parts of India and experiencing their life, there's a certain responsibility. So the way I read it is a kind of a complex dialectic of privilege and responsibility, and something which I think in today's world we are very quick to sort of give up. But at the same time, not forget that it's also not affordable for a lot of people. Travel requires resources. Travel requires certain, and like you said, that I experienced the mobility of being a man, so it's also gendered and other limitations. But at the same time, it's an act of responsibility. So let me conclude with this question. How do you think of this in-person interaction in this kind of complex dialectic of privilege and responsibility?
Again, something I have discussed often with Ashish since he created the center.
Of many of your conversations with him.
Because I probably go back and tell him about this conversation.
I hope you
And he, we often complain. We're quite poorly paid at the center, both because it's a public institution, also because the government has it in for autonomous research institutions, and we are still stuck at the 6th pay commission level of salaries. I don't know if people here understand what that means, but it means that we are paid a lot less than our colleagues in central universities and who have regular teaching jobs. And Ashish is unsympathetic to this complaint that me and my colleagues all have. It's like, why are we paid so poorly? And he says, well, what is the price of your freedom? Right? nobody's stopping you from writing anything you want. Nobody's asking you any questions. Nobody's going to fire you if you said that you write your book this year, but you actually wrote it 10 years later, And, frankly, if you ask me, even this much money is too much money for how free you are, intellectually, and in a sense, how much you can devote to your to reflection and to writing and to speaking as you wish, and he's been like remarkably productive. I mean, he's now going to be 89, and he's published 30, 40 books, of which a few are really, really important, right? And he's the highest selling social science author of Oxford University Press, for example. His books are always in print, at least 20 of them out of all of them. And so, his relationship to time and productivity and efficiency and privilege is quite different from the kind of mathematics that we keep coming up against when we have to get our points by UGC rules in order to be promoted and things like that. So that's one. So it is a privilege. You're right. It is a privilege to have distance, freedom, and autonomy. And in this political environment, it is almost near miraculous, which is why our institution is also slowly reaching the point of complete collapse, because of the extreme pressure from the environment. But I mean, it's not like I'm sort of traveling on my own dime, in a sense, right? I mean, just recently, I'll give you an example. I received an invitation from an organization called the KSSP, which is the Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad. Okay, I had never heard of it. They said, we are having our annual conference. We take science to the people. We are part of the All India People's Science Movement Network. And we are having our annual conference in a place called Adimali in Idukki district. And we want you to come and inaugurate our conference and give the opening lecture. Now, I'm like, what is this? Like, what? How did they even get my email? What am I going to say to these people? And if my partner were not from Kerala, and he said, what? KSSP? What? That's a really important organization. He's also a scientist, right? So he knew all about them. And he said, you have to say yes. And I said, where is this place? How am I going to get there? And he said, you don't worry about that. They'll arrange it. But you shouldn't say no. You mustn't say no when this kind of organization is reaching out to you. They must have some reason in mind. Okay, after that I said, okay, can we look at dates, etc. And they said, our conference is from this and this date. We will transport you from wherever the nearest airport to this place. And after inaugurating it, you can leave. Because the whole of the next 3 days is going to be in Malayalam. So I said, well, are you sure you mean to invite me? I mean, this is like, you should invite, I don't know, Arundhati Roy or something, right? And they said, no, madam, it's you we want. And then this lady phoned me, the president of the organization. And I swear to God, she had such a thick accent, I couldn't understand what she was saying on the phone. And I said, okay. She said, I will write to you, we will make all the arrangements, you just have to come, right? And we went, actually went with me luckily, and it was wonderful. It was just the most wonderful experience for me. And they wanted me to speak on what? I didn't put it out on social media, but they wanted me to speak on the impact of Hindu nationalism on the social fabric of the country. Right? To a bunch of science educators, school teachers, and Malayalam language science activists, right? Now, this is my privilege to do this.
Only Kerala this can happen, I guess.
No, but it's also my duty to do it. In a sense, that's what Gautam was trying to tell me, that it is your responsibility. Take this seriously, prepare your speech properly. They had it translated into Malayalam, right? They were thrilled to receive me, and I was just gobsmacked to see this, 1,000 people. I've never had such a big audience in one place. They had taken over the whole town. People had come from all over the state, right? And they all came and took photographs of me, and I felt like a door had been opened for me into a part of this world that I have no natural, organic access to or connection with. So in that sense, I do see it as my privilege that I'm the person that they wrote to. It's my privilege. And it's my pleasure to do something like this. But it's also important that I do it. I think it's important that I do it, especially given the subject they wanted me to speak on, which I'm not free to speak on in my own institution, right? Possibly even in this institution.
That's a really wonderful way to understand privilege as inseparable from duty. I think that's something that you know that quite well. But the idea of privilege and duty as kind of continuous is a fascinating idea, and I think that's the way we should be thinking of our duties that are also our privileges. But I don't want to take any more time, but I think we have a little bit of time for questions and discussions, so maybe we can sort of send the mic around if people have any questions for Ananya.
Hello, thank you for that conversation. My question is based on the little kind of about the book blurb, I guess, that we got. And two of the questions that you say motivate or actually plague you in writing this book is, how do we lose what we lose, and why do we love whom we love? And I was wondering how you explore these questions first, but also why the city emerges as a place where these questions are interesting to explore. Also, kind of another question that's connected to this is the idea of belonging. In a city that you have, say, intimate encounters with, personal encounters with, possibly guided by a sutradhara of some sort. How do you think of belonging or intimacy with these cities? Or is belonging not the right word to use? Like, is intimacy enough? Like, what kind of place is the city in which we navigate, like love and loss and belonging?
Actually, that passage is from the essay on Istanbul, in which the way it plays out is that I'm basically walking and walking and walking. And as I'm walking, these are the questions that are going in my head. And then that became a sort of, blurb for the book as a whole. Because the themes of love and loss are continuous in the book. I think every essay is some sort of a combination of these two questions, about love and loss. And as you said, as a consequence of losing or loving or both, how does that make you feel like you belong or you don't, or you have a place or you don't, or you're an insider or an outsider, or you used to belong but now you're kind of unhoused and estranged from some place where earlier you felt a sense of belonging and rootedness. There's 2 essays in this book about Delhi. So there's 14 essays and 2 are about Delhi. One is a somewhat happier one, and one is called Lost City, actually. And Delhi is where I'm from in some technical sense. I was born here and spent the greater part of my life living here. So I think Western nature of those questions is certainly true for this book. But the answers may be differently worked out in the different cities, depending on how close I actually got to them, or how much time I spent there, or what they really mean to me, in terms of, my own understanding of the world, of my place in it, of life as such, right? So it's not a fixed answer, but the questions are, in a sense, persistent. We have only about 5 minutes, I think, because somebody has a class here. So by 10 to 3, we should start moving out. And
10 minutes.
okay. And if you would, if you want to buy a book or have me sign it or anything, you can do that as well.
Well, if you have no questions, I think thank you so much for being here.
This is really wonderful, and I think you can pursue many of these things if you pick up the book, and I think you'll see that they come to life much more richly than we could do justice in this conversation. Thank you.
So, and thank you, Saikat, for your very incisive questions. Also, I did have fun, and also, it takes one to know one, I think. So, you are in many ways the right interlocutor for me. Thank you so much. Thank you for your very gracious hosting. And thank you to the library.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So, as we come to the close of this engaging session of Vivekti, it is my privilege to propose the vote of thanks, and most probably this is the last session of Vivekti in this session, because no one is in queue now. So this is most probably the last session of them. First and foremost, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Ananya Vajpeyi for sharing her time, insights and reflections with us today. Her thoughts on cities, memories and personal experience have given us much to think about and have truly enriched this discussion. I would also like to thank Professor Saikat Majumdar for leading such a thoughtful and engaging conversation. Its questions and observations helped bring out many layers of the books, making the session both insightful and accessible for all of us. Our heartfelt thanks to Department of English and Creative Writing for their continued collaboration and support in making Vivekti a meaningful platform for dialogue and learning. I'd also like to thank all the participants who joined us today. Your presence and attention made this session lively and worthwhile. Lastly, but not the least, I would express my appreciation to the STHU Library team for organizing this event, and currently that everything ran smooth. Thank you once again to all of you. Now I would like to call on the stage Dr. Shantanu Ganguly for felicitation. In between, I would like to announce that books are there. If you want to purchase, this is the lowest ever rate that you can imagine. So you can purchase it from there, and the faculty is there. You can get it signed.
Shimona, please. Will felicitate. Will felicitate Ananya. Yeah.
Oh, you have to felicitate.
Yeah. Just with a small.
This happened in Kerala also.
Yeah. So, this, please, will just a small.
Small, it's quite large.
Oh yeah.
This is another one also.
Wow, thank you.
And I'm sure you are going to write the next book on the places which are in Delhi, special places which you have visited, or in India.
Sonipat has to feature.
And then there should be a book on institutions. That you mentioned in your
Ashoka very well.
Yes. I think you should write a book on institutions. You have visited so many.